Narrative. The theory of narrative or narratology has been an active branch of literary theory and literary study that rely on theories of narrative structure, on notions of plot, of different kinds of narrators, and of narrative techniques. The poetics of narrative attempts to understand the components of narrative and analyzes how particular narratives achieve their effects. Plot. What are the elemental requirements of a story? Aristotle says that plot is the most basic feature of narrative, that good stories must have a beginning, middle, and end, and they give pleasure because of the rhythm of their ordering. A plot requires a transformation. There must be an initial situation, a change involving some sort of reversal, and a resolution that marks the change as significant. If narrative theory is an account of narrative competence, it must focus also on readers' ability to identify plots. Readers can tell that two works or versions of the same story. They can summarize plots and discuss the adequacy of a plot summary. Unlike poetry, which gets lost in translation, plot can be preserved in translation from one language or one medium into another. A silent film or a comic strip can have the same plot as a short story. From one angle, plot is a way of shaping events to make them into a genuine story. Writers and readers shape events into a plot in their attempts to make sense of things. From another angle, plot is what gets shaped by narratives as they present the same story in different ways. Plot or story is the material that is presented and ordered from a certain point of view by discourse. But plot itself is already a shaping of events. A plot can make a wedding the happy ending of the story or the beginning of a story, or can make it a turn in the middle. What readers actually encounter, though, is the discourse of a text. The plot is something readers infer from the text, and the idea of elementary events out of which this plot was formed is also an inference or construction of the reader. If we talk about events that have been shaped into a plot, it is to highlight the meaningfulness and organization of the plot. The basic distinction of the theory of narrative then is between plot and presentation, story and discourse. Confronted with a text, the reader makes sense of it by identifying the story and then seeing the text as one particular presentation of that story. By identifying what happens, we are able to think of the rest of the verbal material as the way of portraying what takes place. What is important in plot is the following points. 1. Who speaks? By convention, every narrative is said to have a narrator, who may stand outside the story or be a character within it. Theorists distinguish first-person narration, where a narrator says I, from what is somewhat confusingly called third-person narration, where there is no I. The narrator is not identified as a character in the story, and all the characters are referred to in the third person, by name or as he or she. First-person narrators may be the main protagonists of the story they tell. They may be participants, minor characters in the story, or they may be observers of the story, whose function is not to act but to describe things to us. First-person observers may be fully developed as individuals with a name, history, and personality, or they may not be developed at all and quickly drop from sight as the narration gets underway, effacing themselves after introducing the story. 2. Who speaks to whom? The author creates a story which is read by readers. Readers infer from the text a narrator, a voice which speaks. The narrator addresses listeners who are sometimes implied or constructed, sometimes explicitly identified. The narrator's audience is often called the narratee. Whether or not narratees are explicitly identified, the narrative implicitly constructs an audience by what its narration takes for granted and what it explains. A work from another time and place usually implies an audience that recognizes certain references and shares certain assumptions that a modern reader may not share. 3. Who speaks when? Narration may be situated at the time at which events occur. 4. Who speaks what language? Narrative voices may have their own distinctive language in which they recount everything in the story, or they may adopt and report the language of others. The Russian theorist Mikhail Bakhtin describes the novel as fundamentally polyphonic or multi-voiced or dialogic rather than monological, single-voiced. The essence of the novel is its staging of different voices or discourses and thus of the clash of social perspectives and points of view. Finally, who speaks with what authority? To tell a story is to claim a certain authority which listeners grant. Theorists speak of self-conscious narration. When narrators discuss the fact that they are telling a story or hesitate about how to tell it or even flaunt the fact that they can determine how the story will turn out. Self-conscious narration highlights the problem of narrative authority. Focalization. Focalization discusses the question, who sees? Discussions of narrative frequently speak of the point of view from which a story is told. But this use of point of view confuses two separate questions: who speaks and whose vision is presented. Focalization also discusses three distinct features. 1. Temporal. Narration may focalize events from the time at which they occurred, from shortly afterwards, or from long afterwards. It may focus on what the focalizer knew or thought at the time of the event, or how she saw things later, with the benefit of hindsight. When third-person narration focalizes events through a particular character, it can employ variations, recounting how things seemed to the character at the time or how they are perceived later. The choice of temporal focalization makes an enormous difference in narrative's effects. Detective stories, for instance, recount only what the focalizer knew at each moment of the investigation, saving the knowledge of the outcome of the climax. 2. Distance and speed. The story may be focalized through a microscope, as it were, or through a telescope, proceeding slowly with a great detail or quickly telling us what happened. Related to speed or variations in frequency, we can be told what happened on a particular occasion. Jane calls this pseudo-iterative, in which something so specific that it could not happen over and over is presented as what regularly happened. 3. Limitations of knowledge. At one extreme, a narrative may focalize the story through a very limited perspective, recounting actions without giving us access to thoughts of characters. Even here, great variations can occur depending on what degree of understanding, objective or external, descriptions imply. Omniscient narration, where there seem in principle no limitations on what can be known and told, is common not only in traditional tales but in modern novels also, where the choices of what will actually be told is crucial. Stories focalized primarily through the consciousness of a single character occur both in first-person narration, where the narrator tells what he or she thought and observed, and in third-person narration, where it is often called third-person limited point of view. Unreliable narration can result from limitations of point of view. When we gain a sense that the consciousness through which focalization occurs is unable or unwilling to understand the events as competent story readers would. A story with omniscient narration, detailing the feelings and hidden motivations of protagonists and displaying knowledge of how events will turn out, may give the impression of the comprehensibility of the world. It may highlight, for example, the contrast between what people intend and what inevitably happens. A story told from the limited point of view of a single protagonist may highlight the utter unpredictability of what happens. Since we don't know what other characters are thinking or what else is going on, everything that occurs to this character may be a surprise. The complications of narrative are further heightened by the embedding of stories within other stories, so that the act of telling a story becomes an event in the story, an event whose consequences and significance become a principal concern. Stories within stories within stories. What stories do? First, they give pleasure. Pleasure, Aristotle tells us, through their imitation of life and their rhythm. The narrative patterning that produces a twist, as when the bitter is bitten and the tables are turned, gives pleasure in itself, and many narratives have essentially this function, to amuse listeners by giving a new twist to familiar situations. The pleasure of narrative is linked to desire. Plots tell of desire and what befalls it, but the movement of narrative itself is driven by desire in the form of epistemophilia, a desire to know. We want to discover secrets, to know the end, to find the truth. Second, stories also have the function of teaching us about the world, showing us how it works, enabling us through the devices of focalization to see things from other vantage points and to understand others' motives that in general are opaque to us.